A highly anticipated virtual summit between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping took place Tuesday morning. That would be local time here in this part of the world. The online exchange lasted about 3.5 hours and covered issues largely related to bilateral concerns. For more on its implications of that video meeting, I have Professor Yang Hee-dong from Ewha Women's University. Welcome back, Professor Yang.
Nice to see you.
And I also have Professor Oh Jun-suk from Sookmyung Women's University. It is good to see you, Professor Oh.
My pleasure.
Meanwhile, joining our session virtually is Troy Stangarone, Senior Director at the Korea Economic Institute of America. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Mr. Stangarone.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Professor Yang, we'll start here in the studio. Let's start with your thoughts then on the few economic concerns addressed by the two leaders.
Well, actually, I should say, nil, almost nil. As New York Times mentioned, I don't see any breakthrough ideas or the agreement from those, 3.5 hour long, the virtual summit. Well, but if you ask me to develop, to make any the forecast predictions about the future cooperation for the economic affairs, I suggest to take a look around what's going on inside the Congress of U.S. and the recent effort initiated by U.S. government towards the allies. For example, the U.S. Senate passed a new act called the U.S. Innovation and the Competition Act in last June to nurture the science and innovation and studies. But this act consists of 7 divisions, and most of the divisions are related with the tracking with the recent development of Chinese government for new technologies and the financial laundering and human rights, etc. And also, that the U.S. government has organized several, at least 3 very critical initiatives to check with the Chinese military actions, such as the Quad or AUKUS and Five Eyes. Those are 3 major military reactions by the U.S. government to check with the China. So if you remember the Phase 1, the trade agreement enacted last year in February, the Chinese government is supposed to buy over $380 billion from the U.S. government at the moment, until the end of 2021 for the last 2 years. But at the moment, that target has achieved only by 60%, because the Chinese government is pretty reluctant to purchase the energy stuff and the manufactured goods, even though they purchase over agriculture, reached almost the 80% of the target. So that is somehow some positive aspects, because this is a single event. You never expect to cause breakthrough start from this single event. But both summits are well aware of their future directions to move on together. And that Phase 1 agreement could be one of very small and close target for their future cooperation.
Right. Then, Professor, despite the absence of perhaps tangible progress on the trade front, there was talk, however, about the possible release of oil from strategic petroleum reserves. Now, the U.S. has sought similar support from Korea and Japan. How does such action look to affect global energy markets?
It might be understood as a gesture of international cooperation. We already know that as a result of prolonged pandemic, that most countries they took the expansionary monetary policy, which means spreading money in the market. As a result, inflation is expected. But the problem is that the crude oil price is a measure of cost of production. So other than the level of prices, when the crude oil prices increase, that it might ignite a vicious cycle in an economy around the world. So it will decrease the investment and then decrease the employment, and then as a result, it goes worse and worse and worse. So the gesture of the diplomacy that Biden make an offer to President Xi to international cooperation to lessen the inflationary pressure on the world in the cooperation of the global community. So I might say that at least the speed of the price increase of crude oil will be lessened as time goes.
Right. And broadly speaking, Mr. Stangarone, what has been the response to this virtual summit within the U.S.?
So we've seen responses ranging from highlighting what's been discussed previously here, that there weren't really any significant breakthroughs in the meeting, to suggestions that President Biden appeased President Xi. I think both of those, if we look at this in detail, are somewhat unrealistic. Going into the summit, there was no expectation that there would be any significant achievements. The United States relationship with China has been declining and degrading in recent years. Under the Trump administration, we saw it reach new lows. There are disputes relating to South China, or China's, actions in Xinjiang, its revoking of rights in Hong Kong, to concerns over its own economic practices from the Trump administration that remain, to where China has had obviously concerns over the formation of AUKUS, efforts by the Quad. So all of these tensions wrapped into the pandemic itself, which has prevented President Biden and President Xi from meeting in person, have all taken and allowed tensions to continue to fester. The goal of this summit was ultimately to take and try and reset the tone and help to try to reset the relations. And we don't know if that will happen until we see some more progress in the relationship. But there are two positive things to note from the summit. The first of which happened just beforehand, which was at COP26, where Secretary Kerry, our former Secretary Kerry, and his colleague on the Chinese side were able to take and push forward some cooperation on climate change. And we also, for the first time, saw China agree to take and discuss its nuclear weapons programs with the United States, similar in action perhaps to what we saw with the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. If both of these develop and we continue to make progress on these issues, this meeting will actually have been fairly significant, but we won't know for a while until we can see what progress is actually made.
Right. And staying with progress, as Mr. Stangarone has said, there was progress on the climate front and on issues related to security, Professor O, but it appears that issues related to the global supply chain took a back seat during this video summit. What are your thoughts on that?
It could be possible. I mean, the best bet depends on to finalize this kind of tariff war between two countries. Up till now, the global supply chain has been the center of business gravity for multinational enterprise to gain competitiveness based upon the international specialization in the name of global value chain or global supply chain. But what is the result as a result of spreading global supply chain? That it looks like arrow straightly, arrow like a chain of production processes for maximizing the managerial efficiency of production or distribution, which means there is no roundabout, there is no, that alternative backup is considered to gain the efficiency. So at this moment, it is to the point for the United States to make a suggestion of reforming global supply chain among allies by reducing risks or uncertainties of the supply chain, especially for such a strategic items as a semiconductor or the batteries used for the electronic cars. Biden administration make an offer to the allied nation to work together, maintain supply chain, and to facilitate cross-border movement of essential personnel through the medium of American supply chain. And America will be the hub of a hyper-connection of global alliance. And then as a token of sincerity and collegiality, Biden administration announced the infra investment plan, Invest in American Act. Korea, of course, will cooperate to facilitate the movement of essential goods and services in the world, as well as the essential movement of the people or personnel in a safe manner. So, roughly speaking, Korea will be will be counting the American supply chain.
Right. And staying with efforts by America, Mr. Stangarone, late last month, the U.S. and the EU settled their 3-year feud over steel and aluminium tariffs. Do tell us a bit about the agreement reached, and how do you respond to talk that it comes as part of efforts perhaps to counter China?
Well, the United States and the EU, on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rome, agreed to lift the tariffs that had been put in place by the Trump administration under our national security procedures. In doing so, what they agreed to do was to take and put in place a tariff rate quota. So EU steel exports now up to historical levels will be allowed to be shipped to the United States before facing any tariffs entering the market. And those tariffs, once they reach that level, will begin be putting in place. What this means, though, is that in addition to that, the two sides also agreed to take and further cooperate over the next 2 years to develop measures to, one, deal with overcapacity within the steel industry, and two, to take and also deal with the carbon intensity of steel production. And specifically on the overcapacity issue, when we look at Chinese steel production, China is the world's largest steel producer. It produces 10 times more steel than the next closest country. It's also seen as having significant amounts of overcapacity. And this is something that has been undermining steel production and been a concern of policymakers of both the United States and the EU for a while. And so while overcapacity can be an issue more generally, it's specifically going to be focused at looking at Chinese overcapacity and have the most impact potentially on China when we move forward with whatever type of arrangements they're able to put in place in a couple of years.
I see. Professor Yang, U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai is in Korea on this Thursday to meet with relevant officials here. What do you believe is the focus of this particular visit?
Well, ironically, her parents are the immigrants from Taiwan, even though I do believe that her family background may not cause any impact on her role. But I think there are 4 major agendas in her hands when she visits Korea. The first one is she may try to strengthen the ties of a supply chain with the Korean manufacturing firms for the semiconductors. And also her role to strengthen these ties will expand to any other the technologies or digitals, etc. And the second agenda is the investigation over the rules and routines how the Korean semiconductor manufacturing firms are producing their products. Because simply the Biden government says we cannot make semiconductors in China. Same voices even to Intel. And number 3 is the Trade Expansion Act, Section 232. That was a major cause for the tariff dispute between U.S. and EU government, even though the tariff dispute was dissolved last the month, the 31st of October. And according to that, the act, the regulation, all the steel imports to U.S. government will have about 25% tariff on the steel. And the EU now dissolved that the tariff dispute. That means now the EU steel manufacturers will increase their profits because they can reduce the prices, and those profits will be invested to make new equipment to reduce the carbon emissions. But eventually, that resolution of the tariff dispute makes a negative impact on Chinese steel manufacturers. And number 4 is the dealing with the climate crisis. So these are the major agenda of the Katherine Tai. And what kind of expectations of the Korean manufacturing expect from her visit? I do believe that there should be pros and cons because the CEO of something electronics was invited to U.S. government 4 times this year. So there's some stresses from USTR about exposing some strategies of semiconductors. But absolutely, I think the Korean government and Korean semiconductor firms may have prepared well for the great strategies to break through new ideas, business opportunities from her visit. That's my positive hope.
Right, and moving away from the semiconductor industry to shipbuilding industry here, Professor Korean shipbuilders staged a remarkable comeback in October, securing over half of all global orders for that month to secure the top spot. Now, having said that, how do plans by the U.S. to realign the global chain supply that the global supply chain that you mentioned, look to affect Korea's shipbuilding industry?
It's an eye-opening record. Korea shipping companies reported better than expected third quarter earnings on global port congestion and higher rates. HMM, the largest container shipper in Korea, marvelously reported record quarterly earnings in July to September, consolidated net profit of 9,240% up, reaching to $2 billion on sale. And Pan Ocean, which primarily transport per cargo, recorded the earnings surprise in the third quarter, up 325% of growth on year. And then this kind of expectation will be continue due to the resilience of the global economy, even though there might be contingent upon the speed of recovery, global recovery, but it will continue. So related industry as shipbuilding, there is no ship loading the cargoes at this moment, and then steel industry have already shown far better than expected performance, and then we will make the kind of multiplier effect ever after. It will be true that Biden administration's investment infra investment plan will be a good opportunity for Korean manufacturers, but it will also dangerous risks for Korean manufacturers. That is because that kind of infra investment plan might be used for countervailing power against the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative of China. So Korea may find it ever harder to maintain a balanced act between traditional security ally, the United States, and the largest trade partner, China. Many other countries face the same situation like Korea, including Australia, Norway, Sweden, and China. In this respect, this summit talk between Biden and Xi could serve as an inflection point for China to gain a more evolved notion of importance in the world.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Mr. Stangarone, going back to the deal signed by the US and the EU on steel, right after that accord, I believe you penned an opinion about Korea's interest in such discussions. Would you like to take this moment to share those thoughts with us?
Yeah, when we look at South Korea's steel production, it's the world's sixth largest steel producer. The United States is a major export market. Korea, when the Trump administration took and put in place the 232 national security tariffs, took and arranged to have a quota on exports to the United States, capped at 70% of the 3 years prior to the agreement in terms of volume. Now, the challenge for South Korea is that, one, that quota is still in place. Two, it's a hard cap on exports, so there's no flexibility to go over that. And at the same time, South Korean firms can't choose what types of steel products they want to send to the United States. That's fixed by the U.S. government. So with the EU deal put in place, it places South Korean producers at a disadvantage to competitors in the European Union. Now, the United States is also engaging in talks with Japan and the United Kingdom, and so that will eventually most likely place South Korea at disadvantage to steel producers in those countries as well. At the same time, when we look a little bit further ahead, I had mentioned this agreement on trying to reduce carbon intensity of steel. South Korean steel is viewed as being more carbon intense than steel produced in the United States and the European Union. So that means that depending on what type of agreement that the United States and the EU reach, and I should note that both are open to countries like South Korea joining these talks, which would take and probably behoove South Korea to take and be involved in how these rules are shaped. But if they were not, there's the risk that South Korean steel could then face additional barriers in entry to the United States due to its levels of carbon intensity if it's not able to meet whatever standards the EU and the US put in place. And if we want to go just a little bit further, we know that climate change is a major issue. We know it's something that everyone is trying to deal with. Many of the products that South Korea produces, such as ships and automobiles, are steel-intensive products. And so one would assume that the United States and the European Union will look towards products that consume these steel as well in the long run. And so this could become a longer-term issue for South Korea if, one, it doesn't continue to move to take and decarbonize its own economy, and two, if the EU and the United States continue to move forward in this area.
Right, so that is something that South Korea needs to think about. And along with that, Professor Yang, I'm going to touch upon something that Professor Oh mentioned. Do you believe Korea runs the risk of triggering perhaps economic retaliation from China if it aligns with the US in its efforts to reschedule the global supply chain?
I'm afraid so, because recently this September, the House of Representatives in the US has passed a new act called the Five Eyes, because they want to expand the alliance of military cooperation from US, UK, Canada, Austria, and New Zealand to include Japan, Korea, India, and Germany. If Korea agrees on this act, that may cause very, very significant the stimulus to China. And we already suffered from this revenge from Chinese government in 2017 when we deployed the THAAD missiles from the U.S. And according to one analysis by Hyundai Economic Research Institute, the Korean economy has suffered about $8 billion loss. That takes about 0.5% of entire GDP, whereas Chinese government lost on $1 billion. That takes only 0.01% of entire GDP. So at that time, the revenge only was focused on the tourists, right, and the cultures. Whereas if the Chinese government feels greatly threatened if the Korean government agrees on this, Five Eyes new act, then their revenge will expand to the other industry sectors that may cause more significant and serious impact on the global economy and also the internal economic situation. So I have great concerns. I mean, I do agree that our government has had to maintain bilateral relationship both with the U.S. and but China, but this is a very critical moment for Korean government.
I see, and while I would like to touch upon the possible solutions, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for now. So Professor Yang, thank you very much for your thoughts. Professor Oh, thank you for your thoughts today. And Mr. Stangarone, over in the US, thank you for your time and your words.